The street had folded itself into evening when she ran, one hand pressed to her cheek as if holding her face on. The compound gate banged. Someone shouted her name in a voice that had become a threat instead of a promise. Salimata crossed the puddled lane toward the roadside clinic with its hand-painted sign and fluorescents that hummed like impatient insects. She reached the door and hesitated at the threshold, chest heaving, breath snagging on air, eyes fixed on the laminated price list, taped at eye level. Consultation, sutures, medical certificate, all priced in CFA, all written in a careful script that suggested this place believed in order. Inside, blue plastic chairs, plastic clock, a fading poster of a woman exhaling, and the caption in French that said, to breathe, as if the act could move bruises back in time. When the nurse stepped forward with a tray and a gentle chin tilt, the cashier slid a ledger across the counter with a practiced rustle and said the word before anything else, fee. It is a small word, but it can expand into a wall. The ledger, the stamp pad, the little brass key that opens the drawer, these are the gate. Nurse Awa glanced at the swelling beneath Salimata's eye, and at the smear of dried blood near the hairline where a bottle had met bone, and the triage in her body thrummed, but she was tethered to the ritual of paper. Awa asked for the husband's card for the dossier. The cashier's finger tapped a line in the ledger. Fee first, then file. The routine cadence disguised the cruelty. At the edge of the room, another man, not in uniform, not anyone's official anything, stood with a phone half raised. That was Ibrahim, a motorbike mechanic who fixed carburetors by ear and drove neighbors to clinics when the light went out of their faces. He had seen men talk themselves out of mercy by looking into ledgers and pretending the ink was law. He let the phone drop and stepped forward until he was between the counter and the woman on the chair. He was not a big man, but his presence had the stubborn weight of someone who will not be moved simply because a rule was written by a hand that never bleeds. Treat first, he said, and the word carried over the hum and the fluorescent itch and the 1,000 tiny routines that keep the poor waiting. From somewhere behind them came the husband's voice again, closer now, filling the doorway like a threat dressed as familiarity. He said her name. He said it the way men say a street they think they own. People in blue chairs looked away on purpose, choosing the safety of their own cracks, the smart strategy of not knowing. The cashier lifted the ledger a little higher, another kind of door. And then the system made its cameo in the form of a policeman's badge on a belt that arrived with weary authority. Desk Sergeant Cabaret had walked this path of paper and pain 100 times. He knew which signatures mattered, which ones turned a human mess into something a file could swallow. He asked who would pay for the medical certificate to file a complaint. He asked before asking if someone needed stitches. The wound was visible. The gate was now personified, and it spoke in clauses and fees. Ibrahim did not raise his voice. He said the woman would be treated, and that he would take her to the station after. The sergeant smiled a polite smile that comes from years inside rooms where doors only swing in one direction. Procedure, he said, tapping the ledger. Main current requires a certificate. Certificate requires the fee. Fee requires a receipt. Awa stood with a gauze pad in her palm, the simplest possible solution, stranded on an island of paper. Outside, a motorbike's exhaust ticked as it cooled. A WhatsApp group for the neighborhood committee began to blink to life as one person filmed and another person texted, and a rumor became a small crowd of attention. Everyone breathed. Nobody moved. The moment stretched, because it always stretches here, the long, elastic thing between crisis and care that only snaps when someone cuts it. In the hush, Ibrahim did the simple addition that most people do privately, and then bury beneath politeness. He reached into his pocket and dropped a crumple of notes on the counter. Not for the certificate, but for the sutures. It was not a bribe, not a shortcut, just an argument in currency for the order of steps. Awa understood. She moved fast and clean, the way you do when movement is both compassion and rebellion. The sergeant's eyes flicked down to the ledger like a man checking a clock and finding it disobedient. The husband stood in the doorway and hesitated as if the clinic had shifted a few centimeters further away from him. The gate had not opened. It had been ignored. And in the act of ignoring, another door somewhere else began to rattle against its hinges. By morning, the lane remembered everything. On WhatsApp, the video circulated with captions that told different truths. In one version, Ibrahim was the hero who stood between a fist and a face. In another, he was a show-off, making a spectacle of a private matter and disrespecting tradition. In the most dangerous version, he was accused of kidnapping a man's wife under the pretext of care. Screens amplify and compress. Quickly, the domestic wound became public and partisan. The clinic's reception desk became a conversational hinge. Awa's name threaded through neighborhood audio notes, her voice described as insolent by a cousin of a cousin who had never met her. The blue chairs multiplied in rumor. At the police post, the sergeant told his colleagues that people no longer respected procedure, that amateurs were inserting themselves into sacred processes, that chaos wore the face of compassion. Ibrahim felt the city tilt under his feet as the husband filed a complaint that used words heavy with accusation but light on facts. He had not expected applause. He had expected quiet and medical tape and a station visit where someone would write what happened and not what was convenient. Instead, he found himself sitting on a bench outside the station where a handwritten sign warned against interfering in domestic affairs. The gate was now a door with peeling paint. The husband had friends. The sergeant had a rhythm. The first page of the ledger had already been turned. At the clinic, Awa had given a discreet statement to a volunteer paralegal who arrived with a manila folder and eyes that had learned to wear a kind of armor. The paralegal's name was Isa, and he had the habit of reading aloud small lines from laws as if they were poetry. The law said a victim of violence had the right to immediate care and to be shielded from further harm while paperwork waited its turn. Isa's fingers traced those words like a prayer. He knew the clause would be contradicted by a departmental memo buried in a drawer, which, in turn, would be trumped by an oral tradition in which fees presented themselves as destiny. He asked Awa to describe the order of events. She spoke like a nurse marking a chart. Simple, precise, stubborn with the truth. He wrote it down and dated it. In this city, dates mattered. They showed whether you were early or late to a door that liked to watch people arrive out of breath. Meanwhile, the husband began to invert the narrative until it sat upside down and seemed to function. He told neighbors that Ibrahim had touched his household, which is to say had touched his authority. He told the sergeant that this intervention was an insult dressed as virtue, that a man had been humiliated in public, that a phone had made a family problem into a market spectacle. The words custom and respect were heavy coins. He slid across the counter. They clinked when they landed. The sergeant nodded, as men nod when the ledger inside them aligns with the ledger on the desk. He issued a summons to Ibrahim with a flourish, stamped it once, twice, because the sound of a stamp on paper makes a small law each time it falls. The clinic door now drew another kind of crowd. Community women came with headscarves pinned tight and voices that could move furniture. At their head walked Madame Kadi, who sold produce in the morning and ran a WhatsApp group that had de-escalated more fights than the police had ever heard about. Her voice was the voice of long markets and longer memories. She asked after Salimata, who had taken refuge in the women's shelter inside the parish compound, a place with bolted windows and honest mattresses. Awa told her the swelling would go down, the stitches would hold, but the certificate still had no paid stamp. And the desk sergeant had reminded everyone that, without it, the complaint would sleep in a drawer. In this city, people take a breath before paying because the breath tells them if the payment is medicine or ritual. That morning the breath came back as anger. The video had made the shape of the wound public. The ritual had made the wound bureaucratic. Ibrahim, summoned and tidy, went to the station with Isa and with the receipt for the sutures and the testimony of his own common sense. The waiting room smelled of dust and tired uniforms. The sergeant leafed through a stack of forms, as if searching for the one that would make inconvenient facts behave. He informed Ibrahim that interfering with a complaint was itself a complaint. He tested the sound of the word custody, rolled it around like a lozenge. Isa recited the clause again, in a quiet voice, eyes on the desk. The sergeant glanced at the clock, whose second hand had slipped loose, circling without advancing. In a corner, a door stood ajar to an office where a man with a different kind of authority sat reading a report titled with a phrase that would become a wall in the story: Zero tolerance policy. Domestic harm. It had been drafted in a season of speeches and then tucked away when budgets grew thin and dust grew thick. Its champion, the leader, had not forgotten it. He had merely been waiting for the ledger to misbehave loudly enough to merit a visit. When the leader stepped into the station minutes later, he did not bring a motorcade or a sermon. He brought a folder, a pen, and a habit of standing where gales of excuses die down. He listened to the sergeant. He listened to Isa. He looked at the ledger and then at the woman whose signature was absent because the certificate had not been stamped because the fee had become a door. He closed the folder and placed it on the desk. "Care and paper," he said, voice low. And in that moment, the escalator of the day, which had been carrying everyone toward a predictable basement, hesitated. There are interventions that explode. This one breathed. The leader did not rearrange the station with anger. He asked for water. He asked for a chair for Salimata when she arrived, for shade for the women who waited outside, for the husband to be seated so that the words, when they came, would enter a room that did not confuse thunder with justice. He used the furniture as punctuation. Issa, his aide here, but also something fiercer, a truth-teller with a map of the rules in his head, opened the folder to the zero-tolerance policy drafted months earlier, its edges dog-eared from too much hope and too little use. It spoke of sequence. Safety first, evidence second, payment last. It was not a radical concept, only a decent one, and it had been judged expensive by people who do not spend nights in clinics. The leader asked Awa to recite the timeline in her chart voice. He asked the sergeant to explain the departmental memo that seemed to contradict the policy. He did not humiliate him. He simply made the memo say its name out loud. The sergeant brought out a thin paper with a line that required a paid certificate before a complaint could become a case. Issa traced a finger under the line and then under another line in the older policy. He spoke so softly that you had to lean forward to hear him, which is a way of making respect a condition for comprehension. "This is the door that makes breath wait," he said. The leader nodded. Ibrahim, invited to speak, did not tell a story about himself. He said the woman was bloodied, and that the clinic had been made to choose between mercy and a stamp pad, and that he had paid for sutures, because that is what men who fix things do when they are in rooms with broken sequences. He did not say he was brave. He did not need to. The husband, whose name mattered less here than his decisions, crossed his arms and watched the room recalibrate around a principle he had never considered neighborly. He said, lighter now, that he had been provoked, that she had spoken sharply, and the sharpness had turned his patience brittle. He looked at the floor where dust made small constellations. In that small admission, the room heard an old logic and rejected it with its silence. The leader asked a final question of the women outside, inviting them in two at a time so the truth would not have to shout. Madame Kadi, hand still stained with tomato vines, told the plain version. The door of the clinic had been used as a toll gate, not a threshold. The sergeant stared at his cluttered desk as if the pile of forms might convert itself into a shield. "We follow procedure," he said reflexively. "As one might say grace before a meal prepared with ingredients you did not buy." The leader turned the phrase with a tilt of his head. "Then we must change the procedure so that it follows us." He announced the intervention, not as a decree, but as an ordering of steps everyone could see. He called it the first safe breath. The rule was simple. When harm arrives, the first act is to create safety and restore breath, then to document, then to bill the state, not the victim. The clinic would treat, then alert. The police would receive, then protect. The certificate would be generated without prepayment, and its cost settled through a fund replenished monthly and audited publicly. He said, "We will treat first, bill later." And the sentence fit itself like a key into locks that had held for years. Nurse Awa blinked as if a weight had hopped from one shoulder to another. She asked how the secrets of the ledger would be managed, what would happen when the month ran out, but the injuries did not. The leader spoke of a small line in the municipal budget, redirected from ceremonial fuel to the harms people live with. He's outlined how the clinic's receipt book would change. A new stamp in red ink for first safe breath, a carbon copy routed to a shared digital folder so auditors and citizens could see in a dashboard that the breath was being honored. Outside the station, two boys pressed their faces to the window to watch governance happen like a lesson. A door somewhere in the machine swung slowly to a new resting place. The husband's face had lost its earlier certainty. He asked about forgiveness. He asked about pride. The leader answered neither directly. He described consequences without heat, a protective order enforceable within hours, attendance at a course where men unlearn the algebra that turns love into ownership, community service, at the shelter where mattresses must be turned and floors kept clean because the dignity of those rooms is part of the city's lungs. He spoke of accountability like a set of rails, not a cliff. Around his voice, the room settled. Before leaving, he walked to the counter where the ledger lay open like an old book in a church that has forgotten its God. He turned to the page of the night before. He drew a thin line through the requirement that had become a wall and wrote, in his square hand, a date and a new order of operations. He did not raise his voice. He did not tear a paper. He altered the sequence, and in this city, sequence is destiny. Interventions are lightning. Investigations are the thunder that arrives after and explains the light. Over the next week, Issa and a small team of municipal auditors, teachers on leave, and one quiet guard from the shelter moved through the places where breath had been taxed. They examined the clinic's receipt books. They compared ledger numbers to WhatsApp timestamps and inked signatures to the digital trace of who had stood at which counter at what hour. They found a pattern too tidy to be accidental. A memo had become a toll booth. In the police posts and in 3 clinics, the requirement of a prepaid certificate had mutated into a culture of come back tomorrow, which is a way of making harm wait until it stops insisting on being believed. The ledger had been an accomplice, its columns arranged not to count compassion, but to count compliance. Essa collected artifacts that spoke in their own flat voices. There were receipts stamped paid next to empty complaints stamped pending. There were audio notes from women who had accepted their bruises as permanent because someone told them an unpaid form is a kind of silence. There were messages in Telegram groups where men advised each other how to resolve in-house before someone with a badge made it expensive. There was a spreadsheet on a borrowed laptop where a clinic administrator had quietly tracked the hour between a knock at the door and the first syringe, ashamed of the average it produced. The numbers surrendered their secrets reluctantly, then all at once. They brought these findings to a room with a screen. Not a dramatic press conference, just a clean wall and a borrowed projector and benches, arranged the way you do when you expect not applause, but questions. The leader sat without a microphone, his aide standing off to the side with a stack of documents bound with string. The first slide on the wall was not a chart, but a photograph. The clinic door, its hand-painted sign, its price list curling at the edges. It was a door like any other, and that was the point. Issa walked them through the exposure with the same soft voice he used at the station. He named the broken mechanism so it could not hide. He called it the prepay barrier, and beside the name he showed a simple flowchart of the old order. Injury, demand, delay, denial, despair. Then he overlaid the rule they had adopted. First safe breath. He showed a mock-up of a public dashboard that would go live within days, listing 3 measures almost embarrassingly simple. Door to help minutes, denials last 24h, and complaints resolved under 72h. Sergeant Cabaret sat in the back, his posture not defensive so much as deflated. He had become the face of a system he did not invent and could not imagine refusing. On the screen, Issa highlighted the clause from the zero-tolerance policy and the later memo that had warped it. The edges of those papers glowed as if embarrassed under light. The leader did not point at the sergeant. He pointed at the desk. A desk can be a bridge or a dam, he said. We are changing the furniture. From the crowd came the voice that mattered most, community voice. Madame Kadi asked about the fund, the months that stretched longer than budgets, the possibility that the first safe breath would become an empty slogan if the drawer ran dry. The leader answered with a ledger of his own making. He described how the clinic would bill a central pot weekly, requests reviewed by an external committee of retired matrons, a teacher, and a market representative. He named the perverse incentive they were banning, commissions tied to paid certificates, and the replacement. Small stipends for staff whose door-to-help minutes trended downward, capped to prevent gaming, publicly posted to shame delays into extinction. The exposure also reached the husband's house, where men sat with their tea and their defensiveness. He watched the video of the screen on a neighbor's phone and heard words like protective order and mandatory course. The public nature of it all dislodged something. He did not confess. This is not that story. He arrived quietly at the shelter with a cousin and asked what compliance looked like. He was shown a paper with a schedule and a signature line. For once, a form was a ladder, not a wall. At the end of the presentation, the leader asked the sergeant to stand with him, not in front of him. He did not seek a spectacle. He sought a statement that the door had moved. The sergeant, stiff in a uniform that suddenly felt decades old, nodded to the room and to the screen where his outpost's performance line pulsed. Anemic, and then, if the plan held, healthier. He signed a pledge in ink that had no legal force but mattered in the way small ceremonies do. He promised that no complaint would sleep because a fee had not woken it up. The room did not clap. It breathed. Someone said, Inshallah, without irony. The projector fan purred. A young clerk near the back opened a notebook and, for the first time in months, wrote down a plan that felt like work he would be proud to do. The reform did not arrive as a parade. It arrived as a laminated card clipped to lanyards and taped to counters in clinics and stations. First safe breath protocol. Treat first, bill later. Beneath, 3 lines in clear type. Create safety. Document harm, route cost to city fund. A QR code sat in the corner like a small square window. It led to the public dashboard. On day 1, the numbers were humbling. Door to help averaged 42 minutes. Denials in the last 24 hours, 7. Complaints resolved under 72 hours, 2. The board did not flatter, it indicted. But it was visible, in waiting rooms and kiosks, shared into WhatsApp groups where people now argued with data instead of rumors. Training was painfully simple by design. Issa ran drills that looked almost childish. He set up a chair by a door, called a name, simulated a bruise with a strip of cloth, and timed how long it took for a nurse to arrive with water and a blanket. He choreographed the passing of a form like a relay baton, so that it no longer felt like a barrier but a handoff. In the police post, the sergeant practiced the phrase, "You're safe now. The paper can wait," until it no longer stuck in his mouth. Some officers rolled their eyes until the metrics thread in the staff telegram channel began to rank posts by door-to-help minutes. Pride finds new routes when old ones are closed. The fund was small but steady. The city cut fuel allocations for ceremonial convoys by 10% and rerouted that line into the first Safe Breath account. Each clinic received a monthly allocation based on the previous month's treated cases, audited by the committee with more wisdom than titles. The ledger changed. The red stamp for First Safe Breath appeared on receipts like a seal on letters worth opening. When a cashier forgot and a fee was demanded, the complaint channel hissed to life. A simple number with an SLA, call, text, or scan, and someone would arrive within an hour to correct the sequence. The first time the correction squad arrived at a clinic door, the entire front desk staff stood taller afterward, as if a door had been repaired while still on its hinges. In the station, a modest wall-mounted board tracked outcomes with magnets. Green for compliant cases, yellow for delayed, red for denied. The colors bit at pride. The sergeant, once the face of the gate, became an unlikely ally, walking to the board in the morning and shifting magnets with a visible wince when needed. He developed a habit of stepping outside at dusk, breathing the air the way one breathes after cleaning a room, assessing whether the day had been a bridge or a dam. Ibrahim saw him there one evening and nodded. The sergeant nodded back. It was not friendship. It was a truce built on a shared rhythm. Enforcement had teeth, but not fangs. 2 clerks were disciplined for extorting certificate fees, their names not blasted, but posted in the staff hall with a note about the rule they broke and the principle it violated. One clinic administrator resigned quietly. Another asked to be reassigned to maternity, preferring the honest exhaustion of birth to the old compromise of ledgers. The protective order process shrank from a week to a morning. A judge on rotation signed orders with a spare signature now that the city messenger brought cases in batches, pre-sorted, the way a market woman pre-sorts tomatoes to save you time. The husband whose actions had started the avalanche attended the course. He sat with men whose faces carried the sediment of sorrow and excuses. The course did not absolve. It introduced a mirror. At the shelter, he swept corridors, stacked mattresses, learned the weight of another person's rest. He signed in and out. He waited on benches, outside sessions where women spoke to counselors, learning the geometry of waiting for once. He returned home with a thin booklet, not redemption, just a program, and a schedule for check-ins that would become, over months, a habit or an exposure. By the 3rd week, the dashboard lines began to bend. Door to help dropped under 20 minutes at 2 clinics. Denials last 24H hovered at 0 on alternate days. In WhatsApp groups, people began to gossip about the pace of help instead of the price of it. On the market's edge, Madame Kadi kept a small notebook where she tallied respect. Who had arrived when they said, who had returned what they borrowed, who had learned to use the complaint number like a broom, sweeping a corridor free of small debris that once tripped larger intentions. The reform seeped, which is the only way reforms survive. Months softened the sharpness of the night that the city had watched a woman run. The clinic's sign was repainted. The laminated card grew fingerprints and survived. The first Safe Breath became less a policy than a reflex. Nurses placed water on counters before forms. Cashiers reached for the red stamp before the blue. The police learned to radio the shelter when a complaint arrived after dark. The shelter learned to prepare a bed by the ledger's clock, not by the old habit of wait and see. The dashboard became boring, which is the victory of safety. Door to help stabilized under 12 minutes. Denials ticked some days to 0 and stayed there often enough that the absence of a red number no longer felt like a miracle. Complaints resolved under 72 hours hovered around 80%. Then nudged forward, a millimeter at a time, the way a door broken in winter learns to close quietly again. The husband kept sweeping. He did not become a saint. He became punctual. He attended the course until the routine stripped the glamour of remorse and left only choices. He greeted Ibrahim once in the market with a nod that the city pretended not to notice because some acknowledgments need privacy to live. Salimata worked mornings at a tailor's stall, hemming school uniforms and laughing easily when scissors misbehaved. Her stitches scar was a pale line that did not ache in rain. On certain afternoons, she walked past the station, did not flinch when the sergeant, now thinner in the face, stood outside checking the sky for weather he could not control. For the leader, the protocol became a template. He carried the rule into other rooms where breath had been taxed. the registry where newborns waited for names until fees were assembled, the transit office where an expired sticker could empty a day of its dignity. He changed their furniture, too. The words traveled. First safe breath, then paper, then bill to the system that exists to carry our edges when they splinter. Isa kept the dashboard honest, posting monthly culture checks that reported not just numbers but habits. The checks noted that the evening shift maintained pace, that market days did not thicken delays, that the temptation to invent new tolls was being resisted, and when it wasn't, punished quickly. The blue chairs in the clinic aged into the story. Their legs scuffed the same tiles that used to collect long minutes. The door's paint chipped and was repainted without ceremony. Children grew up seeing the laminated card and assuming that help had always arrived in this order. They would learn later that it had not, and that is how culture cements, by letting the next generation mistake the hard one for the natural. The ledger itself changed texture. Its pages turned less often in search of payments and more often for signatures acknowledging care. When a new cashier was hired, she learned the red stamp's placement on her first day and did not ask questions that would have once been a test of courage. There was, of course, another night when a woman ran. The city is not cured by a single naming, but this time the clinic door opened without bargaining. The sergeant called before anyone asked him to. The shelter light was on because it stays on now. The complaint number stitched into the laminated card worked, and someone answered on the second ring with a tone not of surprise but of routine. The woman slid into a system that no longer demanded she perform gratitude for meeting the minimum. Her breath arrived before the bill. In the end, the truth that had surprised everyone was not the drama of the rescue, but the plain arithmetic of sequence. A ledger can be a gate or a bridge. A door can be a toll or a threshold. Breath can come before billing. When a city decides these things in its small rooms and then refuses to forget, the boredom that follows is the kind that lets markets hum and schools make noise and evenings belong to families that no doors will open. Ibrahim fixed a carburetor in the fading light and heard, through the open window, the clinic's clock tick. Somewhere a form was being signed after a bandage had been tied. It is an unremarkable sound, which is how justice should sound once it has learned to live where we do.